Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in a person's life when decisions appear to rise from logic, strategy, ambition, or the relentless pursuit of a goal. Yet, if we look closely as a neuroscientist studies the electrical murmurs of a firing neuron, we find that many of our most defining decisions are shaped not by pure calculation, but by a single human influence, one voice, one presence, one mind that enters our orbit and alters the trajectory in ways we do not immediately recognize, but slowly come to understand. Human decision making, as many of you know, is not the cold mechanical process we once believed it to be. It is a symphony of neural pathways, memory patterns, emotional associations, risk, reward predictions, and the subtle imprint of someone who matters. And sometimes that influence becomes so profound that it determines the very direction of our greatest endeavors. Tonight, I want to explore how one person, a woman of far greater depth than the world will ever know, became a silent architect of some of the biggest life decisions ever made by a man who lived his life under the spotlight of global scrutiny, not through control, not through manipulation, but through the rare power of understanding another human being at a level that bypasses intellect and reaches the core of decision making itself. When you spend enough time studying the human brain, you learn that influence is not imposed. It is absorbed. It happens in the micro interactions. A comment delivered at the right moment, a question that reshapes a line of thinking, a silence that forces you to confront a truth you've been avoiding. And sometimes, influence appears in the form of someone who sees your fractures long before the world sees your genius. Someone who recognizes the internal war behind the calm expression, the fears hiding beneath the bold ideas, the exhaustion buried under the determination. For years, he believed his decisions were entirely his own. The public certainly believed so. They saw him as a force of will, someone who made choices like a scientist firing rockets into the sky, calculating velocity, fuel weight, atmospheric resistance. But the reality was more human than that. Behind some of his greatest choices existed a person whose insights penetrated deeper than strategy. She had a way of perceiving not just what he wanted to do, but why he wanted to do it, and even the reasons he was afraid to admit to himself. One of the earliest examples was during a period of absolute overload, a time when he was juggling the birth of multiple companies, global expectations, and the creeping fear that one misstep could collapse the entire structure he had built. Neuroscience tells us that under chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning and rational decision-making, becomes compromised. People under immense pressure often default to short-term survival thinking, even when they appear outwardly composed. She noticed this long before he did. There was a night, deep into one of the most demanding phases of his life, when he sat with her after a 19-hour workday. The room was quiet. He wasn't speaking, not really. He was thinking aloud, fragmented, looping thoughts, the kind that happen when someone is trying to process, but lacks the cognitive clarity to see the full picture. Most people, listening to such fragmented speech, would try to offer reassurance or solutions. She didn't. Instead, she observed, with the patience of someone who understands that the brain needs space before it needs advice. Then she asked a single question, not a dramatic one, not a philosophical one, just a question. Are you making this decision because it's right, or because you're afraid of what happens if you don't? Neuroscientists call this a metacognitive trigger, a prompt that forces the brain to shift from emotional processing to analytical evaluation. It was a small question that created a seismic shift. He later described that moment as the first time he realized she could see behind his decisions. Not the public explanations, not the rational arguments, but the emotional currents driving them. And that was the first time she influenced a major decision. He slowed down, not in ambition, but in self-destruction. He delegated a fraction of his load. He allowed a pause in places where he believed pausing was impossible. That decision, though invisible to the world, may have prevented a collapse that would have altered the course of everything that followed. Influence at its highest level rarely looks dramatic. It looks like someone telling you something so true that it rearranges your internal map. Years later, during a moment when he debated launching one of the most ambitious projects of his career, she once again became the gravitational pull that shaped the direction. The world saw the decision as bold, visionary, perhaps even reckless. But she saw something else. She saw the internal calculation he wasn't admitting, the desire to outrun a sense of stagnation he felt within himself. She knew that if a person makes decisions to escape a feeling rather than move toward a vision, the brain interprets the goal not as expansion but as avoidance. So she challenged him. Is this the mission? Or is this the distraction from something you don't want to face? And he paused, truly paused, for one of the few times in his life. That pause became the pivot that redirected the entire decision. Not because she told him what to do, but because she illuminated a truth he could no longer ignore. When studying human dynamics at the highest level, whether in leadership, innovation, or personal transformation, one pattern becomes clear. The people who change us most deeply are the ones who show us who we really are when the world only sees who we pretend to be. Her influence reached its peak during a decision that the world still debates today, a decision involving not technology, not business, but life direction, a future he almost chose and almost walked away from. The emotional weight of that moment was immense. From a neuroscientific standpoint, it was a classic conflict between the limbic system, the emotional core, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of logic and long-term planning. He was exhausted, torn, uncertain, and she did something extraordinary. She didn't advise him. She didn't persuade him. She simply reflected him back to himself. She reminded him of a value he had nearly forgotten, a value buried beneath years of responsibility, pressure, success, and sacrifice. She reminded him that decisions are not just about outcomes, they are about identity. An identity, when lost, can take years to rebuild. That reminder altered the decision, and that decision altered the future. Her influence wasn't about power, it was about clarity, the rare clarity that comes from being understood not at your surface, but at your core. And that brings us to something fascinating. Neuroscientific evidence shows that when a person feels deeply understood by someone, the brain releases oxytocin and reduces activity in the amygdala, the region responsible for fear responses. This combination lowers emotional defenses and makes a person far more open to re-evaluating their choices. In other words, being understood literally rewires the decision-making process. That is what she gave him. A space where the noise quieted enough for him to hear his own thoughts clearly. The world believed he was guided by logic alone. But the truth is more beautiful, more human. Some of his greatest decisions were shaped by the presence of someone who understood him better than he understood himself. And through that understanding, she didn't just influence what he chose, she influenced who he became. Because becoming is always the final consequence of the choices we make, especially when those choices are shaped in moments of vulnerability. And every great mind, no matter how brilliant, has moments when clarity blurs, when pressure distorts perception, when ambition grows louder than intuition. In those moments, having someone who can ground you, not by limiting your vision, but by reminding you of your center, can define the direction of an entire lifetime. There was a moment many years later when he faced another crossroads, one that seemed on the surface purely professional but, in truth, carried a profound emotional dimension. The world saw the calculated risk, the bold move, the transformation of an industry, but she saw the deeper layer, the quiet fear behind his confidence. The fear of failure, yes, but also the fear of losing himself in the very success he had spent years striving for. She knew that when a person stands on the edge of a massive decision, they are not choosing between two paths, they are choosing between two versions of themselves. And in that moment, she didn't offer reassurance. She didn't say, "You'll succeed," or "You'll figure it out." She said something far more powerful. "Whichever path you choose, Make sure you're choosing it from courage, not from fear. Neuroscientifically, that statement is profound. Courage and fear occupy different neural networks. Fear is anchored primarily in the amygdala, generating rapid responses based in survival. Courage, however, emerges from the interplay between the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with emotional regulation, conflict monitoring, and long-term reasoning. When someone reframes a decision by invoking courage, they shift your brain's operating system. They reorient your perception. They invite you to move from reactivity to intentionality. And that is exactly what happened. Her words caused him to revisit the decision, not from a place of pressure, not from a place of external expectation, but from a place of internal alignment. That shift, subtle yet powerful, altered the direction of the entire project. It became not an escape, not a gamble, but a deliberate act of creation. The kind of choice that builds futures rather than alleviating anxieties. What made her influence unusual wasn't just her insight. Many intelligent people are insightful. What made it extraordinary was her timing. She understood the rhythm of his mind. She sensed when he needed to talk and when he needed silence, when he needed challenge and when he needed comfort. She could read the micro expressions he didn't even know he was showing. The slight tightening of his jaw when he was internally resisting something, the shift in his eyes when he was avoiding a truth, the way he spoke faster when his mind was trying to outrun an emotional weight. People often assume influence comes from big moments, dramatic gestures, but neuroscience teaches us the opposite. The brain changes most in micro moments, in the small encounters repeated over time that shape neural pathways through consistency, not intensity. Her presence became one of those consistent signals. At one point, during a period of extraordinary public scrutiny, he found himself pulled in multiple directions. Expectations from the world, responsibilities from his companies, and the private sense that he was losing control of the narrative of his own life. Public pressure activates the same neural circuits as physical threat. The brain does not distinguish between a predator in the wild and millions of eyes analyzing your every move. Under such conditions, decision-making becomes skewed. People often become reactive, impulsive, defensive. But she had a way of cutting through the noise. She had a way of reminding him that the world's opinion is not a compass. She once told him very quietly, during one of the most chaotic weeks he had ever experienced, "You don't have to respond to everything. You only need to respond to what aligns with who you want to be." Those words created cognitive relief, a reprioritization of mental load. His mind, overloaded with external noise, suddenly recalibrated. It wasn't about reacting to chaos, it was about anchoring to identity, and neuroscience supports this. When a person reconnects with their core values, activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex increases, which helps integrate emotion and reason, leading to better, more stable decisions. Even the decision to take certain personal risks, ones that carried emotional vulnerability rather than technological complexity, was influenced by her. He was someone who could take astronomical risks in business, yet hesitate deeply when it came to personal openness. That's not unusual. Many innovators who can gamble billions on an idea struggle to gamble their heart on another human being. Emotional vulnerability lights up neural pathways associated with uncertainty and potential rejection, far more threatening to many people than financial loss or public failure. But she encouraged a different kind of bravery in him. Not the kind that launches rockets, but the kind that lets someone be seen. The kind that allows a person to admit when they're hurting. The kind that says, "You don't have to carry everything alone." And one night, after years of guarding parts of himself, even from those closest to him, he opened up to her about a fear he had never voiced. The fear that all the relentless striving, all the building, all the pushing of human limits would one day leave him empty, disconnected from the very world he was trying to improve. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't solve it. She simply listened with a presence so complete that it allowed him to process what had been locked inside for years. That conversation later shaped a massive decision. A decision aimed not at innovation, but at preservation of emotional well-being. A decision nobody but him and her had any influence over. And though the world never knew its origin, her impact was woven into every part of its outcome. Her influence wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It wasn't something that could be measured on a chart or displayed in an interview. It was the kind of influence that happens when two minds meet at a level deeper than language, deeper than logic, a level where understanding becomes a mirror that reflects the best version of you back into existence. But perhaps the most significant decision she influenced came during a period that tested the limits of his endurance. He was at the intersection of exhaustion and expectation, a dangerous psychological state where even brilliant minds can make catastrophic choices. His brain was overloaded. The neural networks associated with clear thinking were frayed from lack of rest and relentless stress. He was considering a path that would have stretched him beyond any reasonable capacity, a path motivated not by passion, but by a punishing belief that he had to do everything, solve everything, carry everything. That belief, common among high achievers, is rooted in a distorted sense of responsibility, often shaped in childhood or early career experiences where being the one who fixes everything becomes part of identity. She recognized the danger instantly. She told him, in a quiet voice that carried more authority than any boardroom, "You can't save the world by destroying yourself." Those words struck him with the force of truth he had been avoiding for years. And for the first time, he reconsidered the cost of his choices, not just on his mission, not just on humanity, but on his mind, his body, his life. She helped him understand something that even the brightest minds often overlook, that the sustainability of genius depends on the sustainability of the human being behind it. That burnout does not destroy ambition, it destroys the capacity to pursue it. That brilliance needs rest as much as rockets need fuel. And because of her, he changed that decision, quietly, without fanfare, without public explanation. But that change preserved not only his future contributions, but his ability to remain connected to himself. Her influence, then, was not a single act but a pattern, a slow, continuous shaping of the inner architecture of his choices. She didn't lead him. She didn't follow him. She walked beside him with a kind of intelligence that doesn't seek attention but creates transformation. And this is where the science becomes deeply human. The brain is not just an organ of thought. It is an organ of connection. It changes in response to the people we love, the people we trust, the people who understand us. Long-term relationships, especially those defined by emotional depth, create neural maps that guide our perceptions, our judgments, our decisions. She became one of those maps. He could navigate the most complex technological systems on Earth, but she helped him navigate the far more complex system within himself. And the decisions that shaped his life, the decisions that shaped industries, futures, possibilities, were touched, directly or subtly, by the presence of someone who believed not in what he could build, but in who he could become. Because becoming is a lifelong process, and the people who influence our biggest decisions are often the ones who help us evolve into versions of ourselves we didn't yet know we were capable of becoming. She played that role quietly, consistently, and at moments when the stakes were far greater than anyone on the outside could ever imagine. There came a time, deep into his journey, when the pressures of leadership had reached an almost unbearable intensity. He was responsible for thousands of employees, millions of customers, and billions of dollars in technological infrastructure. But beyond that, he carried an invisible burden. The fear that one wrong decision could set off a chain reaction with consequences he would never be able to undo. It's a fear few people talk about, the fear of being the fulcrum on which entire futures hinge. Neuroscientifically, this fear activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, a region of the brain tied to conflict monitoring and a heightened sense of responsibility. It creates a cognitive weight that can distort judgment, push a person toward excessive self-reliance, or even trigger decision paralysis. but she recognized the signs long before he uttered a word about it. She sensed the shift in his tone, the way his shoulders carried tension, the way his breathing subtly changed when he was under internal strain. Most people see stress as a surface phenomenon: raised voice, short temper, restless movements. She saw the early signals, the ones barely detectable unless you knew him at the deepest level. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he told her he felt as though he was one mistake away from letting down not just his teams, not just the world, but himself. And she responded with a kind of clarity he would remember for the rest of his life. You're not responsible for being perfect. You're responsible for staying aligned with your purpose. Those words shifted something in him. Perfection is a trap of the amygdala, the brain's fear center, a desperate attempt to avoid criticism, failure, or disappointment. Purpose, however, is anchored in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that allows for meaning, flexibility, and long-term vision. By reframing his burden from perfection to purpose, she changed the neural framework underlying his decisions. He no longer made choices to avoid mistakes. He made them to honor his mission. And the decisions that followed, bold, innovative, transformative, came from that realigned center. Her influence wasn't limited to moments of crisis. It appeared during times of triumph as well, shaping not just his survival but his growth. When success arrived, the kind of success that can inflate egos, distort perspective, or create emotional distance, she reminded him of the importance of humility. Neuroscience shows that humility activates regions of the brain associated with empathy and perspective taking, particularly the temporoparietal junction. It keeps a person connected to others, grounded in reality, and open to learning. She didn't humble him by pointing out his flaws. She did it by making sure he never forgot his humanity. There was a moment, after a major accomplishment, that the world hailed as groundbreaking, when he felt a surge of pride mixed with the quiet fear that success would shift the dynamic of who he was. She noticed it immediately, and instead of congratulating him with the kind of praise that isolates high achievers, she simply said, "This is wonderful, but you're still you." It wasn't dismissal. It was grounding. It was the kind of reminder that keeps brilliance from drifting into untethered self-importance. It helped him maintain the delicate balance between confidence and humility, a balance that became critical in decisions that required both boldness and wisdom. And then, perhaps unexpectedly, there were moments when she challenged him in ways no one else dared. She questioned his assumptions, not out of doubt, but out of a belief that he was capable of deeper reasoning than what he was settling for in the moment. She pushed him to stretch his thinking, to confront contradictions, to consider perspectives he tended to overlook. A partner in thought, not just emotion. He once described her influence as something that didn't push him forward or pull him back, but rather widened his field of vision. Decisions that once seemed binary became multidimensional. Problems that once felt overwhelming became structured. Ideas that once felt risky became responsible. That kind of cognitive expansion is a hallmark of relational influence. The brain grows when challenged by someone who understands how to question you without diminishing you. Her influence shaped emotional decisions as well. Decisions about relationships, family, and identity. For someone who lived so much of his life under scrutiny, emotional choices often felt more dangerous than professional ones. The brain interprets emotional vulnerability as risk, triggering protective mechanisms that encourage withdrawal. But she understood those defenses. She recognized when he was retreating, not out of logic, but out of fear of losing control. In those moments, she didn't demand openness. She invited it. She created an emotional environment safe enough for truth, even uncomfortable truth, to surface. And those conversations, those fragile revelations, influenced decisions about love, connection, and personal evolution in ways he never could have predicted. She helped him realize that emotional intelligence wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The ability to communicate clearly, to apologize genuinely, to understand the emotional needs of others. These were not soft skills, but fundamental components of sustainable leadership. There was a point when he faced a decision that could have fractured a meaningful connection in his life. He was leaning toward an emotionally distant choice, the kind that protects you in the short term but isolates you in the long term. And she gently asked him, "Are you making this decision to stay safe or to stay true?" That question cut straight through the layers of rationalization he had built around himself. Safety, in that moment, meant emotional retreat. Truth meant vulnerability, and he chose vulnerability, not because it was easy, but because she helped him understand that courage in emotional matters is just as important as courage in innovation. That decision strengthened his relationships in ways he never anticipated. Her influence also emerged in decisions that shaped his legacy. Legacy is not a singular act. It is the sum of thousands of decisions, each influenced by the values and perspectives that guide you. She became part of that internal compass. She reminded him that the measure of a life is not only in achievements, but in the impact those achievements have on others. She encouraged him to consider not just what he was building, but why he was building it, and for whom. One night, after a long conversation about the future, she asked him a question that would echo through many of his later decisions. What will remain of you when the world has forgotten your name? It was not a question about fame or recognition. It was a question about essence, about contribution, about the invisible imprint a person leaves behind, the ideas, the values, the possibilities. Neuroscientifically, such existential questions activate the brain's default mode network, which is responsible for introspection and meaning-making. It pushes a person to think beyond the immediate, beyond the tangible, into the realm of legacy. And he realized that the decisions he made, the big ones, the small ones, the life-changing ones, were all threads in a future tapestry he would never fully see. That understanding altered how he approached his work, his relationships, and his own self-concept. And she was the catalyst for that shift. Her influence didn't just shape what he did, it shaped who he dared to become. Toward the later years of their connection, there was a moment when he found himself contemplating a decision that terrified him more than any technological gamble ever could. The decision to choose peace after a lifetime of chaos. Peace can be frightening to someone who has lived in motion for so long. The brain becomes addicted to adrenaline, to challenge, to urgency. Stillness feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But she recognized that his nervous system needed rest, that his mind needed space, that without periods of recovery, even the brightest mind burns itself out. One evening, she told him with quiet certainty, "You don't have to earn rest. You have to honor it." Those words marked a turning point. He began making decisions with sustainability in mind, decisions that protected his mind, safeguarded his energy, and allowed room for reflection. Decisions that not only extended his capacity to build, but also deepened his ability to live. And that may have been her greatest influence of all. She taught him that a meaningful life is not built on perpetual motion, but on intentional motion. That rest is not the opposite of progress, but its foundation. That clarity does not come from intensity, but from presence. In the end, her influence was not measured in the number of decisions she shaped, but in the quality of the person those decisions allowed him to become. She helped him evolve into someone more grounded, more self-aware, more emotionally resilient. Someone who understood that greatness is not a product of solitary genius, but of the relationships that challenge us, comfort us, and illuminate the parts of ourselves we cannot see alone. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. Our biggest life decisions are never just ours. They are shaped by the people who walk beside us, who see us fully, who believe in us even when we doubt ourselves. They are shaped by the ones who understand that influence is not about control. It is about clarity. It is about helping another human being see the path that was always there, but hidden beneath layers of fear, pressure, and expectation. So when we ask how she influenced his biggest life decisions, the answer is simple and profound. She illuminated the parts of his mind he could not access alone. She steadied him when the world became too heavy. She challenged him when he risked becoming smaller than his potential. She reminded him of who he was, who he could be, and why his choices mattered. And because of her, he made decisions not just with brilliance, but with wisdom. Not just with strength, but with humanity. Not just for the world, but for his own evolving self. That is the power of one person, one presence, one extraordinary mind, to change the course of a life, not by steering it, but by awakening it. And for anyone listening tonight, let this truth settle into your own life. Sometimes the most transformative influence comes from the person who sees you clearly enough to help you choose the version of yourself you were always meant to become. And when you find someone who brings that kind of clarity into your life, someone who expands your thinking, steadies your emotions, elevates your decisions, you will discover that the greatest journey you will ever take is not the one you make alone, but the one you build through connection, understanding, and the quiet, profound influence of someone who believes in your possibility. Thank you.